Hello and welcome back to No Worse Off, our podcast on all things restructuring. I'm Lindsay Hingston, a partner in the Freshfields restructuring team here in London and your host for this episode. Today I'm joined by the Freshfields Global Head of Restructuring, Ken Baird, and also one of our senior associates, Jamie Murray-Jones, who is making his second appearance on the podcast and who has broken his paternity leave to be here with us. So thank you for that, Jamie. So today we're really excited to be launching a new sub-series of No Worse Off, which we are calling No Worse Off Hot Topics. And those who've been in the market for a while may recall the name Hot Topics, which used to be the name for our seminar series, which is very much so the inspiration for this podcast series. The plan for Hot Topics is to explore the world of restructuring and insolvency one jurisdiction at a time. We are going to take listeners across all of our international network, zooming into a different jurisdiction in each episode, giving you a practical look at the local market trends, legislative shifts, and court decisions that are shaping the restructuring landscape. The Hot Topics podcast will be running in parallel to our original No Worse Off podcast, so we will continue to bring you insights on the broader world of restructuring, but alongside we'll be doing this deep dive on different jurisdictions. In this first episode, we are not actually going to do a jurisdictional deep dive. We're going to set the scene by providing a bit of an overview of cross-border themes and restructurings in general. So to get us started, Ken, and before we get into those global themes, can you tell us why are we launching this series now and what are you hoping listeners will get out of it?
Thank you, Lindsay. And I'm delighted to see the Hot Topics back now in the guise of our podcasts. It's a very timely place in history as well to pick this up as we see the global economy now facing a further set of economic shocks from the conflict in the Middle East. I think we'd all seen the effect of COVID and the effect of the Ukrainian war and seen some very resilient economies and businesses getting through that. It is going to be interesting to see how those businesses take another shock, bringing some of the same pressures, including potentially increased interest rates, inflation, supply chain. It's all the same themes, but now we're entering almost a full decade of pressure for business. And that coincides with what I think is almost an accelerated pace of change in the restructuring environment. You know, what we see in London and in New York, increasingly we see the tools that are developed there being adopted, used elsewhere. So whether you go to Amsterdam or Paris or Abu Dhabi or Hong Kong, there's an increasingly common set of clients looking at a potentially larger toolbox, no matter where it may have started out, as part of the potential strategy for how you address either a restructuring or a liability management exercise, which is one of the key points we'll come to discuss later on in the podcast. But that doesn't mean the toolbox is one size fits all. What's become increasingly apparent as you look to do either an LME exercise or a restructuring in a different jurisdiction is you've got to be sensitive to both the legal and cultural backdrop in that jurisdiction. And cultural backdrop, what do we mean by that? Well, you may be dealing in a local jurisdiction with local banks who've got a very different view of how you do a restructuring, a very different view of how you recognise losses, for example. And you've got to be conscious of that because you can't just jump into that restructuring with size 10 boots and expect it to fit. Equally, you've got to be very sensitive to how local legal tools overlap, interplay with the international restructuring tools you're bringing to the situation. Because if you don't recognise the sensitivity of local practitioners, markets and desires, you're going to be into real difficulty. And I think that's where we, as a global team, think we can give some real insight into these issues in the different jurisdictions. And I think we're also very well equipped to talk to these points because one of the things that we pride ourselves in is being a very joined up business. So I look forward to a whole series of these podcasts in different jurisdictions where we can try and bring the mix of local expertise and sensitivity mixed with the global toolbox that we're now seeing.
Yeah, just to echo what you've said there, I've heard Marvin Knapp, one of our German partners, refer to it as we're all speaking the same language but in different accents these days when it comes to restructuring. And it's amazing the extent to which practitioners across our network are grappling with the same sort of issues, but in the context of their own local regimes and local tools, but the same legal questions coming up again and again, just being applied in a slightly different way in different jurisdictions. The next question is picking up that point, really, and the fact that there is this commonality of themes across different jurisdictions. What do we think are the key themes, the key hot topics at the moment on the international stage that people are debating in the restructuring world? Jamie, maybe coming to you for that one.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. And it's great to be back on the podcast. I think the way we see it, there are a few dominant trends from last year that will continue to be relevant in 2026, some of which we highlighted in our 2025 in review episode if people want to go back and listen to that. First of all, particularly prominently, we expect to see continued stress testing of the court-based tools. So 2025 marked the year when new generation court-supervised restructuring tools, like the UK restructuring plan, the German Staro, the Dutch WOA, the French accelerated safeguard, were all truly put to the test. Although all of these tools were modelled on the US Chapter 11, each regime offers a bespoke approach to cram down and fairness. The positive spin is that this creates a competitive marketplace among jurisdictions vying to offer a cost-effective forum for restructuring, giving borrowers and indeed creditors a broader range of options when they look at how they want to implement. However, there's also at the same time been a perception of growing complexity and legal risk around these court-supervised tools, which we see as driving a flight to contractual solutions. And what are these contractual solutions? So first of all, and particularly prominently, we've seen the rise of US-style liability management exercises in Europe. 2025 saw these LMEs that have long been popular in the US arrive in force in Europe, as evidenced in deals like Victoria, Selecta, and Hurtigruten. This is an absolutely cross-European phenomenon, with LMEs, or at the very least the threat of LMEs, popping up on deals involving issuers in Germany, France, the UK, and the Netherlands, to name but a few. This then engages directors' duties questions across these jurisdictions, where long-running assumptions that duties considerations would inhibit LMEs in Europe have been very much put to the test. And related to that, and particularly European, we've also seen an increase again in the use of intercreditor drags as a tool of enforcement, and indeed as a tool to implement these sort of contractual exercises. The LME toolbox that was developed in the US has the potential to be turbocharged in the European context when it's combined with the contractual tools under market standard, typically English law governed, intercreditor agreements, which do not exist in the same way in the US, and in particular, the intercreditor drag, which we'll come back to later in this podcast when we talk about Selecta briefly. Ken, is there anything else you would highlight?
A couple of things, Jamie, and it's interesting you referenced the increased risk and uncertainty around some of the legal tools. I do look back with fondness on the days when people didn't bother going to the Court of Appeal. We managed to navigate schemes of arrangement for about 20 years with, I think, one Court of Appeal case. And the Wild West was really ours to play with as we chose. We're in a much more structured world now where we've got significant and now numerous authorities on restructuring plans in particular. And it doesn't make it easier to be creative in that environment. So careful what you wish for when you appeal. I guess two other things I would highlight. The conflict and intercreditor conflict has always been a feature of restructurings, almost by definition. But restructurings kind of mimic life, right? I mean, most economies at the moment are trying to make the tax take be big enough to service all the many competing demands on an economy. Restructurings are the same. If the pie's not big enough, everybody's fighting over who gets their share of it. And what I think we have seen is a move away from what one might call cross-stakeholder or cross-class tension and conflict between who gets the biggest slice of the pie, moving into an intra-class set of disputes where even within a class of creditors, there is a greater focus on people trying to maximise their position. And as we see the rise in structures where you've got the possibility to do non-pari passu type LMEs and restructurings, that is going to become a bigger feature of what we see. The other big news, which everyone has been talking about for a couple of years now, is cooperation agreements. They've become a real new battleground, particularly in this sort of class warfare, if I can use that phrase. Originally conceived as a shield for creditors against aggressive sponsors and debtors, it's ironic that these have now increasingly become the tool between co-op members and non-co-op members, and that's injected a whole new set of tension and fear in some ways into creditors. When a situation begins to evolve, do you jump into that co-op or stay away from it, and what's the dynamic? The other thing we can't really avoid talking about is the increase in the litigation risk and challenge around restructurings. It's obviously a byproduct of the first point, which is if the pie's not big enough and people are getting increasingly creative about how to try and get a bigger share of it, then people are going to hire their good DR lawyers to try and find a way to challenge that. And I think we'll see that more and more as there is a move away from court-driven processes that give you a definitive outcome and a much higher threshold of, if you like, appeal risk, to the ability to threaten, to throw a spanner into the works of a complicated, consensual, quotes unquote, restructuring or LME, where the potential for litigation to be the only solution to preserve your interest as a creditor has come to the fore. And we only expect to see more of this as the market continues to evolve.
Ken, when we think about these trends, do you think it's right that they're truly global trends as we presented them, or do you think they are essentially US and European phenomena?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because we always used to say that when the US caught a cold, Europe would sort of pick it up afterwards. And that's been the trend in restructuring, particularly LME techniques have evolved in the US, kind of moved to Europe, and we've seen that really in full bore now in the LME space. And I guess the question is, how much does that then translate to the thinking of practitioners in Asia or MENA or other markets where the same clients we're working for everywhere are involved in and looking for opportunities? And inevitably, those same clients and advisors will look into that common toolbox. And it's definitely the case if you look at some of the recent Asian restructurings, they have drawn on some of the technology developed in Europe, probably embracing it less comprehensively than we might have thought. But that goes back to the cultural differences in these jurisdictions. So if you're doing restructurings in that part of the world, you've got a very different set of cultural dynamics to, for example, Europe or the US. Equally, you've got complex tools in MENA, onshore, offshore, etc. But the same tools are relevant and people will dip into them. So it is the case, but I think it's also fair to say that with the real centre of gravity of restructuring still being US in the sense of New York law and Europe in the sense of English law, that will always be the place where the changes are most rapidly evolved and adopted, and it will be an episodic adoption of those elsewhere. But again, it's very important that as a practitioner, you're aware of the option to use these tools, because you never know the right circumstance in which you can bring a new dynamic to a market that hasn't thought about it.
Yeah, that's really true. And as somebody who does quite a lot in the Middle East, I think bringing those international perspectives and techniques to a comparatively new regime in some of the Middle Eastern jurisdictions, it can be really interesting to see what you can do with the tools they've created there. So moving on, we said at the introduction that part of the podcast is about effectively global trends as they apply with local dynamics in different jurisdictions. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at a few examples from recent cases where we've seen that collision between international trends and local dynamics, and things potentially playing out in a way that wasn't entirely expected or that market participants took as a bit of a surprise. And I was going to start that with a reference to McDermott, which was a couple of years ago, and we've spoken about on the podcast before. But I think what was interesting about that case is it was a parallel track UK restructuring plan and Dutch WOA that were launched sort of simultaneously. So they were very much so running in parallel. It was conceived at a time before the case law last year in England. So the Virgin Active approach to restructuring plans was still dominant, which effectively meant that all of the focus in the English case was really around demonstrating that the dissenting creditors were out of the money in the relevant alternative, and having done so, you didn't really need to worry about anything else. And what emerged during the course of that case was that the Dutch courts were going to take quite a different view of that, and actually there was a lot more focus on the reorganisation value coming out of the plan and how that was being distributed and whether that was being allocated fairly and in accordance with absolute priority, a modified version of which applies in the Netherlands. And so there was a real collision, in a way, between the two processes around the valuation. And then that was combined with process differences, where I think that case really demonstrated the extent to which the English process is a little bit inflexible. Once you've started the process, once you've launched, you've kind of got the terms that you've got, and there's relatively limited room for manoeuvre in terms of changing those terms partway through the process. Whereas in the Dutch process, the court at an initial hearing looked at the terms on the face of it, felt there were concerns with them. So in came Michael Broders, our Amsterdam partner, as the restructuring expert, and he was then able, through the process, to iterate those terms and evolve the plan, which in the end resulted in the dissenting creditor getting a meaningful share of the equity, which wasn't initially on the table. And again, that dynamic was quite challenging for the case, because you had these two processes running in parallel, and so you kind of had the English process set on a particular course and not able to change alongside a set of terms that were changing in the course of the Dutch process. In the end, that came good. And actually, the English court took comfort from the changes that were happening through the Dutch process in sanctioning the plan in England. But I think the whole thing was quite an interesting case study in this point around similar tools on the face of it, but actually they play out very differently in the different jurisdictions, albeit I guess since then England has arguably moved a bit closer to the wearer in how we think about valuation, at least.
It's interesting with McDermott, you sort of have the differences between the English and the Dutch jurisdictions in some respects pulling away from each other and in that way driving the dynamics of the deal. And you can contrast that with Selecta, where again you have a Dutch jurisdiction, but there's also an English nexus. And in that situation, I think we would see that the two jurisdictions in many ways complemented each other or facilitated a transaction that may be more difficult if it was done in just one or the other. Look, we're not going to go into loads of detail on Selecta. It's obviously a transaction that has had the market talking for a while, and so much so that we dedicated an episode to it last summer, episode 17, on which I was lucky to appear. So no point, I think, recounting all of that, but just very quickly worth mentioning that transaction centred around the majority creditors of Selecta using distress disposal provisions in the English law intercreditor. They used the intercreditor drag to effectively change the capital structure. And that intercreditor drag was facilitated by an in-court Dutch share pledge enforcement process because that was the relevant jurisdiction for the purposes of that enforcement. And the creditors took advantage of the fact that the Dutch share pledge enforcement process is relatively quick and straightforward and crucially gives this key step of the transaction the benefit of court sanction. So in some ways then, Selecta was made possible by that English-Dutch nexus in a way that it may not have been if the share pledge enforcement, for example, had to take place in certain other jurisdictions. One other example of the local context that's maybe worth spending a little bit of time looking at is the Altice France example from the past couple of years, where we saw the unstoppable force of the LME meet the irresistible object of French directors' duties. This deal came as a bit of a surprise to the market, but since then has been very much the talk of the town. That threat, that potential drop-down transaction, set the stage for restructuring negotiations, which ultimately culminated last year in a successful restructuring of Altice France, and one in which Patrick Drahi, the shareholder, was able to retain a controlling stake in the equity. Despite the fact that Altice France happened and there was this threat of an LME, it is worth noting that the general question of whether French directors can implement a drop-down in all circumstances remains an open one, because crucially it wasn't actually tested in Altice France. But perhaps to some extent, whether or not it is technically feasible is less important than whether or not the threat is credible. Clearly in Altice France, the creditors believed it was a sufficiently credible threat that they found themselves at the negotiating table. And that may well be how these situations play out in future.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jamie. And as you say, ultimately, it's still a slightly open question. And these are very nuanced considerations when you're looking at the director's duties landscape and whether that stops LME. It's rarely going to be a complete bright line answer. And I think we've seen that in Germany as well, where more recently the Fleiderer case, again, slightly took the market by surprise, partly because they thought they'd baked in a load of anti-LME language, which was effectively sidestepped through the use of the asset disposal covenant. But it's a similar point around duties there, which is in everybody's minds, Germany is a difficult jurisdiction for directors because we all know about the mandatory filing obligations. And there was almost an assumed read across into must be difficult for directors to do LME as well, whereas actually the considerations around that are quite different and quite nuanced. So I think there's still a lot to be tested around Europe when it comes to LME, and I'm sure 2026 we'll see more of it. So turning now to what all this means in practice, and how is the practical approach to restructurings changing because of these trends? Ken?
I can't resist coming back on a point you just made around the dynamic in Germany around directors' duties, how it plays out in LMEs compared to proper insolvency. And it's a perfect example of how that local cultural dynamic is so important, because you may assume one thing and it turns out that's not what the advice is. So if you don't really have both your finger to the pulse on those issues and the right people advising you, you can go into a transaction from completely the wrong mindset. But coming to what does all this mean, it is fair to say the global restructuring landscape is more strategically complex and, I think, contentious than ever. And the focus has probably shifted from the good old days of let's all get together, do a consensual restructuring or whatever it may be, to a world where you can be facing multi-front conflicts amongst different classes of creditors and even within classes of creditors. And one of the interesting challenges is, as you go into the early stages of a situation or a process, you're faced with quite a complex decision tree matrix. You may have a decision to take about, are we using the documents or using the court? Are we going to use Germany or are we going to use the UK? And if you put that in a decision tree matrix, you've already got to 4 possible different outcomes. You could easily add another jurisdiction to that and possibly another tool to that, and you suddenly got 9 possible outcomes. And so the range of outcomes you might end up being faced with is going to dictate some very important decisions at the outset of a restructuring, because that shapes and narrows the options that you will have as you go through it. So that, I think, is one of the interesting and newer features of where the market has moved. And what that is doing is making it ever more important that the people that are advising you, and this is where we think, to be candid, we do a good job, both have the necessary cross-border insights to take the point I was articulating with Lindsay, to understand the local German directors' duties issues, for example, and what options does that open up, and to be entirely agnostic about which jurisdiction you adopt, because that may be the pivotal strategic decision you're faced with day one. If, like a firm like Freshfields, you don't care about the outcome in terms of where it is, because we are jurisdictionally agnostic, and it makes no difference to us as a business where it gets done, that puts you 2-0 up at half time. If you're in a world where you're worrying about whether your advisors have got the right skill set or the risk of even a subconscious bias as to how to shape a restructuring, you potentially have got a real problem.
And so, at the end of this first episode of our new series, No Worse Off Hot Topics, any final messages we want to leave people with?
I'm going to be a little bit provocative here and really sort of picking up some of the themes that we've been discussing. It's easy to get into the mindset of transaction structures born out of New York or born out of the vast London English law restructuring sort of landscape, and then saying, that's it, we got the answer, one size fits all, and then just ignoring the local sensitivities. Our experience is that increasingly taking the good stuff, the creative and innovative potential solutions from those vast restructuring markets in the US and the UK is only the starting point. The real skill set is applying that to your local environment, recognizing, as I said, the cultural sensitivities of stakeholders in that environment, of advisors in that environment, and very importantly, as we were discussing in Germany, boards in that environment. And to do that, you've really got to have a team that understands what those sensitivities are and how they themselves are evolving in real time. And that's where a firm with our coverage and I think our degree of being very much across the markets as they're evolving everywhere where we operate, and the ability to conjoin that international experience with local sensitivity is becoming the USP I think that people should look to when they're going into a complex restructuring.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's about not thinking you can just lift and drop technology and techniques from one jurisdiction into another, but very much so drawing for inspiration on what you see happening around the world, right? And testing that locally, and how do we adapt that and how do we make that work within this environment? And that's at the heart of what we do.
My final closing comment would be, we've never seen the market evolving so quickly. And what that does mean for us is the need to be joined up and having access in a very agile way to the latest insights, the latest information on deals, the latest techniques is more important than ever, because that's what may give your client the competitive advantage in a situation. And if you can put yourself in that position, then you're very much doing the best job for your client.
All right, I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much to Ken and Jamie for joining me. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for the launch of this new series, No Worse Off Hot Topics.